Hello, I'm Michael Brennan Dougherty, and I'm here with my guest Freddie deBoer for what I think is the first episode of a new series on Blogging Heads, which I believe we agreed to call The Score.
Nice.
And basically, the idea of The Score is that Freddie and I will take turns doing Taylor Swift karaoke for the next 3 or 4 hours, and you'll all enjoy it. So, Freddie, start.
I call You Belong With Me, and I also belong We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together.
Okay, I just wanted 22, the new single, so I'm happy.
Cool.
No, actually, we'll be talking about some sports things and maybe some politics, and the show will alternate between the two subjects as I see fit. So,
Cool.
Anyway, I'm also to reintroduce myself. I am the editor and founder of the Slurve, which is a daily baseball newsletter that you have to pay to get. And Freddie is... Well, Freddie, describe yourself.
I'm a graduate student at Purdue University, and I write a blog called Vote and a couple other places as well.
Yep. And we're coming together this week to talk a little bit about sports, even from very opposite ends of the political spectrum. So, Freddie, the first thing I wanted to talk about was you interacted with something I said in the Slurve this week about sabermetrics, but you hinted at something in there, which is that you came to baseball a little bit later than most people. And
Yeah.
I'd like you to explain that, because everyone else... there seems to be this nostalgia humping in baseball that, I sat with my dad at the game or on his lap watching the game on television, and it seems like you come at it from a different angle.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. The first is that my father was not a baseball fan. He's an academic like me. He was an academic. He was a basketball fan, and, I have lots of great memories of him and his friend Gary, watching basketball and saying cliches like, you got to take it to the hoop. But he was never into baseball, so I didn't have that kind of formative influence. And I'm also, part of the very small minority of healthy American males who never played any kind of organized baseball. And me and my brothers were. And it's it's hard to name people, or it was hard to know anybody who hadn't had the experience of playing baseball.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got involved in baseball fandom fairly late. I didn't really start to seriously follow a season until I was 19 or until I was 20. And that has always kind of conditioned and colored how I kind of interact with the game and how I enjoy the game. For one thing, it's just always been a very cerebral sort of appreciation. I don't know what it's like to feel the grass on my feet as I stand in the outfield or whatever, or how shitty it feels to strike out. And that's part of the reason why it was a natural fit for me, along with timing, to sort of come to advanced stats and sabermetrics. When I first really got interested was really the same time you first started to see Bill James's names everywhere. It was when Moneyball was coming together for the Oakland A's, and so it was a very natural fit for me as a fan.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny, I never played youth baseball either. I was brought up on basketball. I had an uncle who coached basketball, and basketball was cheap to play, and I actually only got my first baseball mitt 2 weeks ago for my birthday, for my 31st birthday. But for me, being a baseball fan was a part of being a kid. My grandparents were Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants fans respectively, and then came to love the Mets. And I remember, being 6 years old and my grandmother being on the edge of her seat, working her curlers and a glass of red wine, and then telling me to pay attention because Darryl Strawberry was coming up to bat, and I should really watch this. So for me, yeah, it's always been a part of me, and I had to, like a lot of fans, adapt to the new sabermetric stuff as it came out, and kind of, I was never skeptical of it. I think like a lot of people my age, one of the things that appealed to me about sabermetrics and Bill James and Moneyball, and eventually sites like Fire Joe Morgan that sort of preached statistically informed analysis of the game, was that these people were kicking everyone's ass at understanding baseball. And I liked, you know, a couple weeks ago when Brian Kenny was on MLB Network debating the Chicago White Sox announcer Hawk Harrelson about sabermetrics. Hawk Harrelson took the Luddite perspective that numbers are the most overrated thing. And Brian Kenny spat, "You missed the revolution." And what I really loved about sabermetrics was the revolutionary aspect of it, was that this was a group of outsiders that were devoted to an idea, and at the same time they were devoted to dethroning a certain kind of lazy sports columnist or TV announcer. And I could sense that energy, you know, which I think is generational and even a little political, and so that really attracted me. Also, it just was part of like playing fantasy baseball and things like that. You know, it was better to know someone's, you know, OBP than their batting average.
Right. I think that the fantasy angle is important because one thing that you know, that stats do, I think, just objectively better has been to predict individual performance. So if you look at a guy who had just an unsustainably high batting average for balls put into play a year before, it's a good example of why he'll probably regress.
Right.
Stats like, you know, FIP, which is fielding independent pitching, or XFIP, which is your expected fielding independent pitching, are better predictive tools for individual performance than traditional tools have been. Now, I would add to that I think a dog that hasn't barked to a degree has been that I don't think that sabermetrics have been proven to be significantly better at predicting team performance than more traditional kinds of analysis. In part, I just think because, you know, team performance is so multivariate; it's so hard to separate out what's going to happen.
Right.
But you know. By the way, Hawk Harrelson, I get, you know, being in Western Indiana, I get Chicago White Sox games, and he's insufferable as an announcer also. I mean, just insufferable. But the thing, I mean, and it's interesting because, again, it was easier for me to accept sabermetrics and to sort of accept numbers-driven baseball as someone who didn't have a long history for which that was going to change. But that also meant that it also has meant that I have less of an emotional investment in the sort of revolutionary kind of idiom in which this has been expressed. In other words, it was easy for me to accept sabermetrics. It's also has been easy for me to accept that I just see a lot of kind of counterproductive behavior among the sabermetrics crowd now, and I see a lot of people who are really failing to understand human nature in the way that they're trying to communicate these things.
Yeah.
And I also think that the general turn towards stats in sports has been a very good thing analytically, and I also think it has made liking sports into a huge pain in the ass, or at least liking sports on the internet. And so I'm in a position of trying to at once argue for the superiority, I mean, the genuine superiority of WAR to batting average, or, you know, FIP to saves or whatever. And at the same time saying, you know, you guys have won and you need to reform the way you are sort of leading this movement.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. So you wrote a little bit about this on your blog in response. You've written before at Wondercomer Mag, a web magazine, and you wrote a little bit more on it this week because I had noticed that, you know, in my thinking, on the one hand, you know, sabermetrics has won the day in the sense of every team employs it to some degree in their analysis of players, in their front offices, etc. It's talked about on the radio, you know, and even on sports radio, people talk about regression to the mean, etc. And, they cast Brad Pitt as the hero in the movie. So, when that happens, usually you've won. But what I've noticed, especially doing this newsletter, is that there are a lot of the journalists and pundits that are devoted to sabermetrics were constantly frustrated with the bullpen and how it's used in baseball because they hate the role of the closer. They think it's a function, they think it's completely irrational. It's a function of a made-up stat by a journalist 35, 40 years ago who created the save. And now teams put their best relief pitcher normally in low leverage situation, which is up by 2 or 3 runs in the 9th inning with nobody on base. And then instead they should use the greatest relief pitchers as starters, even if they're not great starters, and the greatest leftover relief pitcher should be used in a high leverage situation, say runners on second and third, 1 out in the 7th inning or the 6th inning, when the game is most on the line. And what I noticed is that these sabermetrics guys would take unbelievably cheap shots along these lines all the time, as if the only reason that the closer existed was stubbornness and stupidity. That there could be no other reason. And to me, I could think of 10 or 15 obvious reasons why this role exists. And namely because pitchers tend to perform well when their roles are routinized, when they understand the kind of game situations they might go into and know when to expect them, know when to warm up, etc. And in general, people like to play a role. They like to have a name. And the history of baseball, for rational or irrational reasons, has given us the closer's role, and it has closed out, the fireman's role of 30 years ago. And people they like living up to these roles. So just on the purely psychological level, there's a couple of obvious reasons. And on top of that, these are reinforced by the expectations of the fans, and then also by the megaphone that the media gives those expectations. So my question is, if you want to advance to the point where you go back to the fireman role, maybe these sabermetrics guys should invent or impose on baseball culture slowly and through persuasion something like Fangraphs, shutdowns, or meltdowns stats onto relief pitchers. That would be much more productive. And also, I think it's retarded to think that a baseball team is only dedicated to winning. First they're dedicated to making money, for the team and the individual players for themselves. But then they also want to win a certain way. They want to win by playing a role on a winning team, which is different from maximizing leverage in every particular baseball situation. Right? So you might have to bench a guy that's good or better in one situation because you need to impose some kind of discipline on him for loafing it at practice and on the field. You might have to do that as a manager in order to keep morale up. And what I dislike about sabermetrics is that some of the cruder advocates of it seem to discount exactly what you said, human nature. Sometimes you'll be arguing in a bar or something like that, and one of these Adderall nerds will be pushing on you as if psychology played no role in the game whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, and you use the word morale also, and this is the thing. I mean, I have had very bitter arguments online with people where, you get in trouble simply for recognizing that human psychology exists, that human beings are emotional creatures, and that those emotions have real-world consequences, and that part of what a manager has to do, that we'll never understand, is to manage the emotions of their players. So you think about Joe Girardi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Joe Girardi is not in any sense an anti-stats guy. In fact, he has these binders, right, where people have calculated the the odds for all these different situations, and he consults these binders all the time. And every team now has these stats guys that are on the payroll. So, I mean, in the sense in which teams are employing these people, I mean, teams are opportunistic, and they're going to use whatever they can. Now, some teams use them a lot, some don't. But if you look at Joe Girardi, okay, you've got Mariano Rivera, who is unquestionably the best relief pitcher in the history of baseball.
Right.
If you're Joe Girardi, think about the potential good versus the potential benefit of going to Mariano Rivera and saying, I'm going to start throwing you into games in when there's 2 outs in the 6th inning where you're down by a run, because my numbers guys say that's the most rational thing to do by pure winning percentage. That would be the most insane thing that he could possibly do, because it could piss Mariano Rivera off, and he is an absolute key to their success, right?
Right.
And and it's like, one thing I would like to say to anybody out there who's interested in getting involved in sports media is, the cheapest currency in sports media is calling managers or GMs or any kind of executives idiots who don't know what they're doing. You can get that on every blog. You can get that on every website. You can get that on any radio show. There's no more prevalent currency in sports media than people calling executives and coaches idiots. If you want to distinguish yourself, maybe try harder to understand the behind-the-scenes things that you can't observe and make a guess about why they're making a decision that does not seem rational to you. Bill James himself, the godfather of all this, said it's a profoundly stupid thing to do to assume that you know more about baseball than someone who played it for 15 years and managed it for 20.
Right. And the thing is, too, is there's this... I think sometimes that people have fooled themselves with stats, in the sense because all stats can be read as a tautology, right? Like, okay, this person's batting average is this. He will perform at this level. And, of course, it changes day to day, and then you average it later. But at the same time, you have to know that, like you said, these are emotional people, right? So are we to believe that talent is the only thing that exists? Because it's not like that in any other profession on earth, right? Like, if I am stressed out and angry and I haven't slept because I had a bad flight, and then I try to sit down and write something, it is almost always worse. There are more errors in it. I make more mistakes. Are we to believe that doesn't happen in baseball? And why would we believe that? Because we average the errors or the strikeouts at the end of the year? It's actually... It's amazing, I guess, because it's become so opportunistic to take these shots with numbers, that you have a lot of people that are idiots with numbers trying to take shots with them. And I don't know, it's just... You're right, there should be a little bit of humility. Now, I worry a little bit about the rationalizing of baseball. Ross Douthat wrote something a couple weeks ago about, the increase of the 3 true outcomes of an at-bat. And does that make for a more boring game? I'm not sure it does. But I'm open to the possibility that it does. And at the same time, what I like about the Moneyball approach to baseball is that as it's become more common, or as these ideas have spread, the market inefficiencies in baseball have changed, right? So, so for some teams, they will try something like Atlanta has done, which is like a boom-bust offense, one that's not really based on on-base percentage the way others are, because maybe there's an upside to that now, or at least that is a style that they can achieve with the players that were available to them. So they have B.J. Upton and Dan Uggla, etc. And one game they score 15 runs, the next game they score 3. And that... Go on.
Yeah, one thing that I guess there's 2 things that I would sort of add as an extension to what you're saying. Number one is that one of the unfortunate things about the fact that a lot of people, not so much in the media, and again, I'm not trying to big time anybody. I mean, I'm pretty amateurish at this stuff myself, but even though I'm housed in an English department, I am a quantitative researcher. And one of the unfortunate things is that a lot of fans are getting exposure to statistics in baseball and in no other kind of context. And one of the things that happens when you're doing statistical research and you're gradually picking up the statistical knowledge is you could never be fooled into thinking that statistics are more powerful than they are, or not being able to see all the ways that they can go wrong, or not being able to see how limited they can be. And it's unfortunate that, like people are talking about these stats without understanding the difference between descriptive and inferential stats, or between parametric and non-parametric stats. And that's one thing. The other thing is that, and this is another thing that enrages people when I say it, but sports are an inherently irrational activity. I mean, they are filled with pure irrationality. If you wanted to look at like the bulk rule or the infield fly rule and try to sort of reverse engineer them for rationality, you're going to go insane, right? I mean, basketball is guys running back and forth on the same spot, throwing a sort of ball made out of inflated leather repeatedly through a metal hoop, right?
Yeah.
And the effort to kind of like find some sort of perfectly rational behavior within that, or a perfectly rational way to describe that, is always going to end up with you being sort of missing the point. And the easiest way for that to happen is to fail to remember that the purpose of sports, and in the most sort of limited economic sense, is to make money. And that if the product is not fun to watch, the teams will change and the league will change in order to maximize how they make money, not in order to become more rational in any kind of descriptive sense.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because sometimes you have to be rational about the irrationality, right? That when things happen, like I remember in 1996 playoffs in the NBA. People were trying, in 97 and 98, people were trying to study what was going on in the Delta Center in Utah. Because and by the way, everyone who knows me knows I'm an absolute freak about that 90s era Utah Jazz. But everyone wanted to know what was going on, like, because it was so loud. And so people were actually studying even the angles of the seats and why it seemed so, like, oppressive to away teams that are coming in there. And at the same time, there were other people saying, like, can we distract Karl Malone by having away crowds count the seconds that he takes when he's preparing a free throw? Even though if you timed it, he was always within 10 seconds. Right. But he was always at, like, 9.5 when he released. But it actually did seem to bother him in a series when the crowd was chanting. It's because he's a psychological being. No matter how professional he is, when you have 20,000 screaming people in Seattle just counting at you in this eerie way, it can rattle you. Right. And that's actually what makes it so much fun, right? Is that when the other night Steph Curry of the Golden State Warriors just goes off, and then the crowd starts to feed off of it, and he seems to start to feed off the crowd. I actually think one of the things about sports that's so appealing about it is the irrationality, and that is what leads the quote the much derided traditionalist columnists to concoct narrative about it. Right. The game itself, and this would be my defense against some of the more extreme and simple-minded stats people, is that the game itself is a narrative. It's designed to have a beginning, a middle, an end. In baseball, an at-bat is designed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's designed for storytelling. So that's always going to be our natural instinct. Is, if it wasn't that way, we would have just fired all the columnists and just run box scores on every website.
So speaking of that beginning, middle, and end, so here's an example where I think that, it certainly seems likely that the sort of sabermetrics thing has had an impact on the sort of enjoyability of the game. Certainly the rise of sabermetrics has correlated with lengthening baseball games in terms of just like from the first pitch to last pitch.
Right.
Where some of these games it is completely routine for games to last 3.5 hours or longer. And so, it's hard to prove causation, but people have said, a lot of this is that, for a long time, the OBP obsession, which, again, like, that was a perfectly rational response to a really genuine and deep inefficiency, was, people were not taking the walks that they could have, even though a walk is a really good outcome for an at-bat. But, the push towards OBP meant that, all of a sudden everybody was grinding out every at-bat, and everybody, you had these completely common to have 12 and 15 pitch at-bats. And so I guess one of my questions is, like, we're talking about irrationalities and inefficiencies. What are some of the ways that you could change the game? Because to me, part of the reason why I'm so happy to be getting the Slurve is baseball is really long in terms of the games, and baseball is really long in terms of the season. And I have a really hard time, as a fan, keeping up my level of interest for the whole 6 months of the season. I mean, it's very reliable that after the All-Star break, like early August, I just stopped wanting to look at the box scores anymore because I've just been doing it for so long. What I like about the Slurve is that I think that a daily newsletter very much fits with the baseball ethos. I mean, NFL games now, it's every game. You can find literally thousands of pages written about them because you have a week until the next one. So it's very much like a blast of one game and so much analysis. What the Slurve kind of is sort of, okay, baseball is built along the long haul. For me, it's a little bit too much of a long haul. And at this point, I would love for the games to be sped up. I think if I could wave a magic wand, I'd have, instead of a 162-game season and 9-inning games, I would probably choose to have like a 120-game season with 7-inning games. How would you change baseball?
I love the 9 innings, but I'd love for them to be 2.5 hour to 3 hour games all the time. What I'm looking forward to is it was recently announced, I mentioned it in the Slurve a couple weeks ago, that the Independent Atlantic League, which is a baseball league that features the Long Island Ducks and a couple of other teams, they're not minor league teams attached to Major League Baseball. It's a very small professional league with cast-offs from the pros and wannabes from the pros in it. And they've decided to take a season-long experiment in shortening the length of games. So they're going to require that pitchers deliver the ball, I think, within 8 or 11 seconds of receiving it from the catcher. They're forbidding batters to step out of the box. They're limiting the number of timeouts batters can call. They're making managers file reports if the game goes over 3 hours long, as to why it went over 3 hours long. So I just want to see what that is. I wonder if, there are ages in baseball where pitching is dominant, and we're in an age right now where pitching has just roared back and consumed the batter. Every month is a record month for a number of strikeouts in baseball for the past 8 months, just about. I'm wondering if we're also going to see kind of glacial, how do I say this? Eras where the time of game goes up and then goes back down again. Because it seems that, we talked about the length of games extended partly because it seems players were taking more pitches and drawing more walks, slowing the game down. Well, then all of a sudden, when batters get used to that, pitchers then have an advantage of trying to determine the tempo themselves and speeding the game up. And they're constantly hearing that this would be an advantage. So some of them will try that, and I think some of them are trying that. You're seeing a couple of pitchers like Matt Harvey who are very quick to deliver. So I don't know. We'll see. I don't have I can imagine shortening it 140 games. Take 20 games off. Although I think I'd like the season the length it is. Maybe cut a week off in the beginning because it's gotten ridiculous with the number of snow outs and rain outs. and also Major League Baseball's determination to like have open air stadiums even in Minnesota.
Minnesota, yeah.
So I don't know. I want the pace of the game to slow down, but I don't have. I love the length. I actually kind of love the length of the season because I can put a baseball game on television and I can do chores around the house, or I could take a nap and then wake up and still enjoy it.
Right.
Or if the game is really lagging in July or something like that, I can just turn it off and come to it later. And
because no one game means that much.
Exactly. Like with football, you can feel football fans are just, the really super devoted football fans sometimes have 2 or 3 screens going on in their house every Sunday. They'll invite all their friends over and watch from, on the West Coast, they'll watch from 9 a.m. Until 7 p.m. or something like that. And they can't take away because any touchdown could mean a playoff berth for one team or a loss for another. Whereas in baseball, no one game ever feels that important until September, and I like that kind of build up. So I wanted to change pace a little bit. You also hinted this week, or to me maybe privately, that you're not as into fantasy baseball, you're into simulated baseball. And I want you to explain what that is and why it's superior to fantasy.
Feel free to rein me in on the subject, because I could wax poetic about it for a long time. And I would say sim and fantasy are very different, and I think that a lot of people do both and can enjoy doing both. I just do sim now because sim itself will sort of take over my life. So what simulated baseball is it's leagues of people who use computer programs that take stats and they generate likely outcomes from every at-bat and use that to generate a season of baseball. There's a lot of, or at least several different programs. My league uses one called Out of the Park Baseball, which is you come up with rosters, and you can base those rosters on whatever a year's completed stats you want. So there are people who do like dead ball era, and people who do like the 1940s or whatever. We always do the previous year. So we're starting now to simulate a league based on 2012's results. And what it is every player gets this just mammoth statistical package generated about them. And this is not just things like, what's their WAR, what's their OBP, but it's, what's their tendency to hit soft grounders to the shortstop against the left-handed pitcher in the 7th inning.
Oh, my God.
So you have these exceptionally, like every pitcher, they look at every pitch and they see, where is what is the tendency for them to drift over the plate, or how far the catcher has to reach. Every outcome of every foul ball. So it went into the field is divided into all these zones, and not just into like players, but there's like 27 zones in some systems or whatever. And there's also park effects. So a season's worth of games, all 81 games at a particular park, are tracked to say, okay, at this park, there is 0.47% more of a possibility of a bloop single into center right than into center left. And so you generate these statistics, and we as the owners, we have drafts. In my particular league, we have both the major league level. Then we have what we call AAA, which is major league players who are available for us to call up during the season. And then we also have a prospect league. And we simulate a full 162-game season. So I'll put my team out there, and it's filled with players who exist in real life. And they're all based on stats from last year. And they will go up against a pitcher who is a real pitcher who has real stats from last year. It will factor in the defense of the players who are playing, and will factor in the time of game, the weather that the computer determines, and the ballpark effects for all these outcomes. Now, it's completely text-based. Someday we're hoping we'll be able to watch these games, but you just get a box score and you get a play-by-play in terms of every individual pitch, what happens. But it's absolutely addicting. The amount of we do our drafts, we have to do a slow draft. We don't sit down in a room and draft over the course of 8 hours like a lot of fantasy leagues do. We have to have a slow draft where over the period of literally months, usually from January until the time the season starts in April. We are doing a slow draft system for major league level, for a Rule 5 draft, and for the minor league level. And there's just, because it's just like, okay, well, it's not just like I need to balance my lineup left and right. You do, but I need to, I have these tendencies and I need to balance them. And then you can also sort of tell what the computer manager is going to do in terms of his tendencies. You don't get perfect control of the manager, but you can say, you can do all kinds of sabermetric things, like never steal a base, or no sacrifices ever, or only pull this reliever when you want. If you want to do the sort of don't have a closer, use them situationally, you can do that. If you want to, you can sort of really set these tendencies, and you can sort of, so you have a lot of people who sort of, they bat their best hitter. Albert Pujols batted leadoff in this league many times, because a lot of people say statistically that's the best thing to do, because you get him more at-bats in the season. It's a lot of work. You also kind of have to trust the sim, because the sim is going to give you some results you don't want, because, the purpose of the sim is not to sort of repeat back what the player did in real life, because, one of the things that happens is we have 24 teams instead of the 32 in baseball, or 30, so what happens is that because there's fewer teams, the pitching is a little bit better, so the offensive stats are a little bit depressed. But, it's always frustrating when the guy who hit 40 homers in real life only hits 28 in sim. But, you kind of have to trust that. That's the nature of the beast. The other thing is that because we're using last year's stats, you can kind of see your players sucking in real time. I have the blessing of having Mike Trout, and I cannot wait to see what he's going to do this year in sim. He has not been bad at all in real life, but he has obviously regressed so far this year. And it's like, if if your season's going to be a disaster, halfway through this year, I'll know, okay, I have a pretty good idea that my team will be pretty good or pretty bad next year. And that can, for some people, can kind of kill the suspense. Okay. So that's sim.
Well, that does sound nerdier than fantasy baseball.
Oh, it's insanely nerdy. And I will say, by the way, so I'm from Connecticut, and this is sort of a league of people from Connecticut, which is the home of ESPN, and we have a couple of really prominent fantasy guys from ESPN in this league. And one of them says, this is a guy who's on TV all the time, says all the time, when I think about fantasy and sim, I want to talk about sim. Sim is much more fun and much more addicting.
All right, I've got to try it. I did fantasy for about 5 seasons, and I stopped this year because it was one of those things where I became one of those people that just stopped checking. I put all of my effort into a good draft, and I was so good at drafting. I remember, my first year when I drafted Roy Halladay, and everyone's like, "Oh, injury risk. You're going to regret drafting him 8th in this league." And, of course, we were counting complete games. And, it was just beautiful. For years, I was riding Roy Halladay and Mark Teixeira, et cetera. Just great. But I gave it up because I became one of those guys that, you'd be playing against me that week, and 3 of my guys were injured, and you were just going to walk through it.
Right.
There was no glory in beating me. But Sim seems more engaging.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, is it's a little too engaging. And it's hard, it's hard to find people who have the level of commitment that it takes, because it's such a time suck. But the thing, fantasy is inarguable, right? Because it's tracking onto real-world results. If, Josh Hamilton hits a home run in real life, then you hit it, and that's what fantasy is. In sim, you're always a little bit would that really have happened in that situation? Now, the sim is getting better and better every year. The program is really incredible in how detailed its statistical outcomes are, but you can always argue it. And occasionally there are wonky little things. They happen less and less often, but I remember, I think it was in our first World Series, I believe. I could be telling the story wrong. But I think, Chin-Ming Wong beat out, an infield single in, some key part, and people were just going crazy. It's it's the World Series. That would never happen in a million, years. But you kind of have to sort of laugh at it and throw up your hands at it and just, and hope that the program gets a little bit better next time.
Well, though, it's funny, though, because wasn't someone looking through the box scores recently in the World Series and just reminded everyone that one World Series ended when Babe Ruth was caught stealing home, and everyone was saying like that if someone tried this today, everyone would go nuts. Like, why is the fat man trying to steal a home with 2 outs in the ninth inning of a World Series game that he's down in? It's terrible, but crazy stuff happens.
It's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It applies to everything in real life, which is now being observed changes what's being observed, and that's certainly true in sports. And I think it's absolutely true that coaches and managers are maybe more cautious now because they know any wrong decision is going to get pilloried on Twitter and on blogs and on Deadspin and on ESPN.com.
That's right. And, that is actually one of the things that I love the ubiquity of sports in a sense. My livelihood is starting to thrive on that, of course, but it does ruin. I think it does absolutely lessen the chance of managers taking risky decisions, like high upside risky decisions, because it's just so, the fans and the media have this like reinforcing megaphone that they put together where the media stokes fan outrage stokes media intrigue and interest. That media intrigue and interest then has a psychological effect on the players. And
and meanwhile, anything anyone does publicly is going to end up on Bleacher Report or whatever.
Right, and it has an effect, of course, on actual jobs. I mean, people are fired because they make a series of blunderous decisions. For instance, and this directly affects what we were talking about earlier. Theo Epstein talked about in 2003 how they were going to do a bullpen by committee in Boston. And then a few players underperformed, and he said, and then basically the media and the fans got involved, and then the players wanted nothing to do with it anymore. It's like, let's find a closer, let's name him. And there's so much anxiety about that. I mean, and of course, my newsletter thrives on it sometimes. Like in Chicago, the Chicago Cubs this year, it's just been a constant churn of is Carlos Marmol going to be our closer? Is it going to be Japanese pitcher? Is it going to be Kevin Gregg, closer from the Marlins from like 2008?
Will our bullpen ever have a save opportunity, given how bad the Cubs are?
No, that's exactly right.
Or I think like the ESPN effect is, ESPN will decide that a story is a story, and their coverage will become a story. You got lots of criticism for Tebow, but they can just decide. They're so powerful, and that's especially troubling because ESPN is not only like a journalistic entity that comments on sports, but they run the games, right? They have, they run games from the 3 major sports leagues. They have baseball, they have football, they have basketball, and they can drive whatever coverage they want. I mean, there's no story they can't manufacture.
They can. What's interesting about ESPN, and I have a total conflict of interest. I literally just got an email from the ESPN editor while we're doing this, asking me to do something for them.
Well, changing gears, Michael.
But
I was just thinking how great ESPN is for you. I love their quality programming.
People are going to laugh in a month when they see what this story's about, too. They also...
Who's your favorite of the sports reporters? Mine's John Saunders. That guy's it.
No, I love ESPN, and I love the magazine that they... what I love about writing for ESPN Magazine, which is the place where I have a relationship, is... I'll just say this because I like to say it. They're one of the last magazines that is devoted to being a magazine. Like big, beautiful in print, beautiful pictures, graphical displays, they're like one of the last, I think, along with Vanity Fair and a few others, that like revels in the format, and I appreciate that. Having said that, I do think ESPN is they're still the worldwide leader. They're still immensely powerful, but you're seeing that even the networks that are controlled by the sports themselves, like MLB Network, especially, they have a surprising amount of editorial freedom, or they exercise it, and at the same time, there's going to be this host of competitors. I mean, because sports broadcasting rights have become so insanely valuable. There's just a host of competitors now with NBC Sports building up, Comcast, Fox, all the regional sports networks. I think sometimes when ESPN floods the zone on a story, they're doing it because they have some kind of research that, this is juicing the numbers for our viewers for a week or 2 weeks.
Well, let me say this in ESPN's defense is they have an ombudsman on their website, and that role has typically been filled with people who have not pulled any punches. And I could list 20 things I don't like about ESPN, but I think that indicates a certain level of giving a shit, which is important. And I agree with you about the channels owned by the leagues. And one thing I think would be interesting is to compare the coverage on MLB Network to the Yes Network, the Yankees Entertainment Station, I think. It's Yes will, it's I think they literally have a show. It's let's just point a camera at Monument Park for 45 minutes. It's all sun-dappled American flags and Babe Ruth squinting off into the distance. But
it's a lot more fun on MLB.
Yeah. So we're at 45 minutes. Do you want to wrap it up, or do you want to talk about Benghazi?
Let's leave Benghazi on the table. Maybe for another time. I think it's just enough to say that you and I are not in the camp that this is a non-story, and not in the camp, totally with Glenn Beck either. So
right.
We can leave it to the imaginations of the viewers for now, and just leave them with sports, and maybe we'll pick it up again soon.
Okay, great.
All right.
Sounds good.
Take care, Freddie. Thanks.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Bye.